Alright, let's discuss the parts and pieces of the engine coolant system. Now there's tons of videos out there on YouTube and the internet regarding engine coolant systems and how they work, and I am by no means an expert, and those videos probably explain things a lot better, but the only purpose of this is to go over the MGC in particular and discuss how the system works in our vehicle. So we got the engine pump, or the water pump here, driven by the belt, and which also drives the fan. The coolant, we'll discuss it per how it warms up and how the coolant system works, starting with a cold engine. So you start the engine up, and before the system gets hot, the thermostat, which sits right down in here, is not open. So we have a closed system in that case. So the pump takes the fluid that's already in the engine and circulates it throughout the engine. So it'll push it back into the engine, back this way into the engine. It'll go throughout the engine internals, and then it comes up over here on this side is a return line. This return line down here, let's see if I can get my finger in there. Return line right here goes up to a bypass, which is up down in here. There's a small hole down in there that you probably can't see because it's dark, but there's a small hole. And let me grab my thermostat. So this is my old thermostat, and you can see this bottom piece right here sits right above. It's not mated to that hole when it's cold. So this bottom piece will be sitting above that, allowing the bypass to be open. So therefore the fluid circulates throughout the system when it's cold, and it goes all the way through the engine, back, circulates back through to the pump, and then gets pushed back through the engine. So really kind of a closed system in that sense. When the thermostat, once the engine gets up to operating temperature, thermostat, depending on what type of thermostat you have, there are 3 types that are sold for the MG, depending on your climate that you live in. They recommend a 165 for a tropical climate. This is Fahrenheit. A 185 normal, and a 195 for if you live in colder climates. So let's go with, say this is a 185 thermostat. The temperature of the water reaches 185 degrees. This thermostat will open. This top valve will open, and it sits down just like this. So the top valve opens up and allows coolant to flow through the upper radiator hose into the radiator, and then down through. You can see all these the coolant flow tubes up and down. So you got a top part here, which is basically like a tank. There's a top tank which all the fluid gathers, and then it's forced downward through the radiator down to the bottom. It collects at the bottom tank, and then down there you can see the bottom hose, and then it flows up the hose back into the pump. What also happens when the temperature reaches 185 is opening this top valve also closes this bottom one, so the bypass closes off, and therefore the system, it does not recirculate this hot water that's coming out through the return tube, goes up, it forces it to go up into the upper radiator hose instead of going back down through that bypass hole and back into the engine. So both parts, it's imperative that you get a proper thermostat. If you don't get a proper thermostat, if your thermostat does not have the bypass valve function on it, basically it's just this top part right here without this bottom valve, that bypass will be open all the time. Therefore, a lot of that hot water will flow up through here because obviously it's going to go with a point of least resistance. So you got the hot water, you got this big tube up here, you got a big hole that's created once this valve is open, and a lot of the water is going to get forced through the radiator, but some of it, that hot water, is going to go back down through that bypass because you don't have this bottom valve creating a seal and cutting off that flow route, and therefore the hot water goes back into the engine, causing your engine to heat up more than it should if it was just diverting the flow through the radiator, down through the core, cooling it off, sending it back to the pump, colder water, and then forcing the colder water to circulate through the engine. So hopefully that kind of explains how the MGC system works. It's pretty standard. Other parts, you have the temperature probe here coming out of the side, and then also this is the return line from the heater core to heat up the inside of the engine. You got a valve here that is controlled via this wire that's inside of the vehicle, and so when you open up and you turn on the heat, the valve opens and it controls how much hot water flows into the heater core, and then obviously the fan pushes the air through the heater core and into the vehicle, and then this return line comes back down here, returns back into the system down there, and then it gets pumped back through the vehicle or the engine. Let's see, that's about it. I'm gonna go and test this thermostat, so I'll show you how to do that. And I'm replacing it anyway, but I'm going to test this one just to see if it works and to show you how to test your thermostat. Okay, here the bypass is in the open position, so you can see that it's about, let's see, 3/8 ish, 1 3/8 inch down below the lip. So here is the flange, and then this bypass right here is 1 3/8 inches away from the flange. So let's go heat it up and see where the bypass sits after. Okay, so I've got this water just below 160 degrees Fahrenheit, or 165. This thermostat that I have is a 165 degree thermostat. So I'm going to place the thermostat in the water and then slowly crank up the heat, and we'll see what happens. Yep, and the valve is starting to open. I can see some water leaking in right around the edges. Okay, now we've heated it up, and you can see here that the bypass is now at 2 3/4. And if I hold it steady, you'll be able to see it move back in as it cools down. Now at 2 5/8. Or 1 1/2. Sorry, that was 1 5/8. So it started off about 1 3/4 extended, and as it cools down, it'll go back to its resting position of 1 3/8. And then out on the MG, I'll show you the depth of the flange, or that bypass hole, and how this system works to enable this. As it heats up, it expands, puts pressure on that bypass hole, and allows, or it blocks the fluid from going through the bypass. Okay, so here I got the tape measure down, and it's a little hard to read, but it's about 1 5/8. That bypass hole, the lip to the bypass hole is about 1 5/8 inches below where the flange sits. So you can see, as we showed when we heated it up, that since the base, this base here will make contact with that bypass once it's heated up properly and expanded all the way. This base will make contact and block the flow of water through the bypass, and therefore divert all of the water up through the radiator. Okay, I have the new thermostat here, and I wish I had a part number on it, but it doesn't. It just it does have a manufacturer name, Motorrad, is stamped right there on the side, but it doesn't have a part number for me to give you. But it is slightly less depth from the bypass flange to the main flange. So I just want to test it to make sure, one, it's the proper one. I bought a 185 degree Fahrenheit thermostat, so make sure it opens at 185, and also two, to make sure that the flange will, the bypass flange will descend far enough to cover the bypass hole in the plumbing, or in the head. So let's throw this in some hot water and take the temp. Temp is 170. So we'll see when that opens, and then I'll be able to tell if I got the right part, because there's no number on it. And two, we'll measure the bypass flange when it's fully open and make sure that the bypass is going to be blocked off appropriately. Alright, we just passed 185, and I can see that the main valve is opening. So it looks like I got the proper thermostat temperature. And we'll just wait for it to fully open, and then I'll measure how deep the flange, the bypass flange, extends. Here you already can see that it is extended quite a bit down from where it started. and measure it. It is about it's between 5/8 and 3/4. So 1 5/8 to 1 3/4, which is good because as we saw earlier, we measured that the bypass opening was at 1 5/8. So it's just slightly longer than that. So we know that this flange will extend deep enough to seat itself in that bypass hole and block the flow of water going through the bypass of the coolant system. So okay, we know we got the right temperature, we know we got the right flange bypass set up, so now we're ready to install it.